Hey everybody, so as you know, we are writing the scripts for the next few country episodes, which means this is another filler week. So this week, we're actually going to do a reference video, which means you can use this video again and again to share and inform in case if you need to go back to the information. This is actually a topic I wanted to do for a long time, but never got to do until now. We are going to cover the largest and most active IGOs, or intergovernmental organizations. Keep in mind, there's also INGOs, or international non-government organizations. So the largest ones that cover pretty much most of the globe include the IMF, International Monetary Fund, headquartered in Washington, D.C. This was established in 1944, and it promotes basically world trade. It has 184 member countries, and it basically works to improve the financial condition of its member countries. So you can see why a lot of people might want to join it. The WWF, World Wildlife Fund, headquartered in Vaud and Gland, Switzerland. Set up in 1961, this is the world's largest conservation organization. Its main goal is to protect the endangered animals and the areas which they live in. WHO, or the World Health Organization, the WHO, headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. This is actually a subsection of the United Nations, and it promotes health matters worldwide. It also aims to help raise medical standards for countries across the world, and it also helps monitor the diseases in those areas. UNICEF, or the United Nations Children's Fund, headquartered in New York. Established in 1947, it helps to assist the health and welfare of children and their mothers abroad, especially in developing countries. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, aka UNESCO, headquartered in Paris, France. Started in 1946, this organization aims to promote the culture, science, and education of countries across the world. And that's why they come up with a list of those like UNESCO heritage sites every year. The World Bank, headquartered in Washington, D.C. Founded in 1944, its aim is to reduce poverty across the world. It also helps by giving out loans to developing countries. The World Trade Organization, headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. This basically helps assist trade agreements between nations. It has 153 member countries, which make up about 97% of the world's trade. It's like the middleman with, business deals and stuff around the world. The G8 or G20. This is a summit with meetings in host countries that change every year. The Group of 8 is basically made up of the world's leading industrial nations. The heads of each nation meet up at a summit, and they basically discuss various global issues like security and poverty, or at least they're supposed to. In 2014, Russia's membership was suspended after the annexation of Crimea, and in 2017, they announced their withdrawal. The name was then reverted to the G7 until the EU kind of took Russia's spot. It was weird. Altogether, the G8 represents over half of the global GDP and over 40% of the purchasing power parity. And the G20 is the G8 plus the next 12 countries. Together, they make up about 2/3 of the world's population and 80% of the world's trade. And every year, they invite a special guest nation to join in as well and observe. Then we have NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, headquartered in Brussels, Belgium. Basically, this is a military alliance between various countries in Europe and North America, mostly just the US and Canada. It was started after World War II, and it was basically a response to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. It started with 12 countries, and now I believe it's like 29 or something. And finally, disputably the largest one, the UN. It has 193 member states and 2 observer states. The General Assembly of the UN makes decisions on things like peacekeeping and human rights. Many UN peacekeeping missions can be found all over the world, like in the UN buffer zone on Cyprus, as well as numerous other spots, mostly in Africa and the Middle East. So essentially, like, if the world has some issues, the UN talks about it, and they try to do their best. It's where, like, everybody around the whole world talks. The UN also has another affiliate, the UNHCR, which is basically their refugee program. It's made to protect refugees and forcibly displaced peoples across the world. It also helps assist voluntary repatriation, as in people who want to go back to the nation that they were leaving. Otherwise, there's the OECD, headquartered in Paris, France. They describe themselves as being committed to democracy and the market economy, providing a platform to compare policy experiences. Basically, these are kind of like the really well-off countries that kind of get together and talk about things that they can do for the world. Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization, headquartered in Lyon, France. They provide investigative support, expertise, and training to law enforcement worldwide. There's 3 categories of transnational crime that they especially hone in on: terrorism, organized crime, and cybercrime. However, they do cover pretty much every other type of crime. They also help kind of network the policing enforcement of various nations together with database information and so on. I guess kind of is like the world police. The ICC, the International Criminal Court, headquartered in The Hague, Netherlands. They have the jurisdiction to prosecute criminals for international crimes, especially those of genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes of aggression. And this is like a really serious court. Like, you can't really use it unless things are really going down and they're really crazy. Like, this is the court that the United Nations Security Council refers to. It's a big deal. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, headquartered in Vienna, Austria, even though most of the oil producing countries are like in the Middle East. 14 member countries accounting for about 44% of the world's oil production, and they have about 81.5% of the world's proven oil reserves. Therefore, this kind of gives them major influence on global oil prices. So those were kind of the biggest like global organizations. Now let's go into the regional continental organizations, starting with the Americas. The Organization of American States, headquartered in Washington, D.C. This is made up of 35 member countries in the Americas, totaling at about 1 billion people in the Western Hemisphere. Cuba's participation was actually suspended, even though they were never officially dismissed. But then in 2009, tensions were cooled off and they got back in. Essentially, this is kind of like the organization that keeps the American countries talking to each other. And then we have the Council of Europe, headquartered in Strasbourg, France. Basically, like, if you're not in the EU, the closest you can get is like the European Council. It administers nations across Europe and transcontinental nations like Azerbaijan and Armenia. Altogether, it makes up about 850 million people. Basically, its intent is to uphold human rights, democracy, and general rule of law in Europe. However, they can't make any binding laws. So again, it's just kind of like let's talk about things that we would like to imply. By the way, you're going to see that there's a lot of organizations like this, such as the African Union. They have two main political centers, Addis Ababa and Johannesburg, South Africa. Launched in 2001, it basically has every country on the African continent, plus a special extra seat for the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic of Western Sahara, which is why Morocco kind of withdrew from the union for a long time, but then they kind of went back in 2017. This union covers nations that altogether collectively make about 1 billion people, and out of all the official languages spoken at the union, the only indigenous one is Swahili. The Asian Cooperation Dialogue. This is kind of like the closest thing to an entire Asian continent cooperative organization, established in 2002, and it's very like loosely administered. Like the G8, they have summits that meet in different locations every year. The Asia Council, though, does have a headquarters in Tokyo, Japan. The Pacific Islands Forum. They have a secretariat office in Suva, Fiji, which is weird because Fiji was like suspended for 5 years. Now, the funny thing is, Australia is part of this membership, but they alone make up like twice the population of all the other member states and like 5 times the economy of all the other ones combined. So yeah, Australia is kind of important in that mix. In any case, in 2011, the US territories were granted observer status, and in 2016, French Polynesia and New Caledonia were allowed to have full membership. Now, within each of the continents, there's even smaller organizations. For the Americas, you have NAFTA, which just got negotiated on, and now it's like transitioning into the USMCA. Long story short, this is basically the free trade zone between the US, Canada, and Mexico. NAFTA has secretariat offices in the capitals of each country. It's a trade bloc and one of the largest ones in regards to gross domestic product. In 2017, negotiations decided to change it into something called the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, which is basically the same thing with only just like a few small changes in exports with like automotive and aluminum production, and we changed the limits on duty-free items. Moving on, PALACEN, or the Central American Parliament, headquartered in Guatemala City. This is basically where all the Central American countries, except Costa Rica, kind of get together and talk about how they want to move forward regionally. Do they get much done? That's up for you to decide, but yeah. CARICOM, the Caribbean Community. The seat of Secretariat is in Georgetown, Guyana. They have 15 full member states, mostly English-speaking, 5 associate members, all of which are British territories, and 8 observer states. And yeah, basically their objective is to integrate economically and financially and socially all the Caribbean states, all that. Yeah, you get the idea. They're divided into 2 factions, one half which is less developed and the other half which is more developed. And so the more developed countries kind of have to help the less developed ones by policy. The Andean Community. This is basically just Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia. Chile and Venezuela used to be members, but then they kind of dipped out. Now, this is a trade bloc and a customs union. Members actually do have their own Andean Community passports. It's like red and gold. It's relatively easy for member states states to move about each country, and they don't require visas upon arrival. On top of that, they also facilitate economic and business deals as well. Mercosur! It's basically every other country except Venezuela was suspended, Bolivia is a candidate, and all the other countries are just like observer states. Again, like the Andean community, it's a customs union and free trade zone, fluid movement amongst people and goods and currency. In addition, it also promotes things like tax and investment incentives amongst the nations. Which brings us to, of course, everyone's heard of it, the EU, made of 28 member states comprising about 500 million people. Now, the EU is kind of like a country, but not really. It's a union, not a federation or republic, as in each state has the right to secede if they decide to, which is kind of what we're seeing with the UK right now, but it's confusing and that's a whole other thing we won't discuss right now. Nonetheless, they have things like EU passports, EU internal markets, EU standard law. In addition, they have their own monetary union, the euro, used by 19 of the member states. And within all of Europe, you have a bunch of other smaller organizations. I'm just gonna quickly list them and summarize in like one sentence each. The Schengen, it's basically the EU plus all the other places that are not part of the EU, but you don't need a passport to get in. It's easy to work and live in these areas if you are EU citizens. Cyprus, Romania, Croatia, and Bulgaria, although EU members, are still under pending status though. The European Economic Area, it's basically the EU plus the other countries that are allowed to have the same economic policy as the EU. Similarly, the EFTA, it's basically the same thing except it's a free trade zone with 4 special countries that are not part of the EU. Then you have all those other smaller regional organizations like the Nordic Council, the Baltic Group, the Visegrad Group, the Benelux. Basically, all those organizations are just an excuse for all their neighboring countries to hang out and party with each other, or at least that's how I see it. Moving on, the Arab League, headquartered in Cairo, Egypt. Basically all the countries that either speak Arabic or have Arabic as an official language, regardless of whether or not the inhabitants identify as Arab. This is why countries like Somalia and Comoros are members, but they're like, we're not Arab. And don't even get the Moroccans started. Syria used to be a member, but in 2011, their membership status was suspended because I really don't have to explain that much. And just keep in mind, this is not an exclusive Muslim league. There are many Arab people or people that speak Arabic that are not Muslim. However, yes, the majority of the members in their council are Muslim. Which brings us to the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, often referred to as the Gulf Community, headquartered in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. This is another customs union and trade bloc. If you are a GCC member, you can basically move about each and every single one of these countries, except Qatar, but that's a little different. It's essentially every country along the Persian Gulf except Iraq, and it was basically kind of like a move done to counterbalance Iran's influence in the Middle East. Long story short, they even have their own joint military called the Peninsula Shield Force. In 2017, diplomatic ties were heavily severed between them and Qatar. There's a lot of tension. I'm not going to get into it, but basically in 2019, things started to kind of cool down a little bit, and now Qatar is slowly starting to get back into the whole GCC thing. The South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, headquartered in Kathmandu, Nepal. 8 countries, and this is one of the only few bilateral organizations that both India and Pakistan agreed to be a part of. In 2006, they finally launched the South Asian Free Trade Area, which allows 1.6 billion people to interact economically, and it heavily reduced customs duties on goods. So a lot of people were happy. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, headquartered in Jakarta, Indonesia. This is the Central Union for Asia-Pacific Affairs, made of 10 countries, 2 observers, and this organization holds strong influence in the region. It's a free trade zone, a nuclear weapon-free zone. They also manage financial integration matters, food security, tourism, environmental issues, and so on. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. This organization covers about 3/5 of the Eurasian continent and about half of the world's population. Created in 2001 with 5 original states. What is it? China, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. Of all people, Tajikistan, okay. Later, Uzbekistan, India, and Pakistan were added. Now, this is definitely not a customs union or a free trade zone, but they operate in many other fields of activities like security concerns, especially with counterterrorism and drug trafficking. They also promote economic and cultural cooperation, and so on. Moving on to Africa. ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States. This is another trade bloc and customs union, as well as a peacekeeping force. They have a court of justice, a parliament, a bank for investing and development, and so on. It has 15 members in West Africa, 9 of which, mostly French-speaking, use the West African franc as their currency, and the English-speaking ones are actually considering using their own currency called the ECO. In response to ECOWAS, you have ECAS, the Economic Community of Central African States. Basically, same deal. It's made of 11 countries, mostly French-speaking Central African states, 6 of which use the Central African franc as their currency, and their primary objective is to sustain a Central African market and peace amongst the region to the best of their ability. And in response to that, you have SADC, South African Development community. It's basically 16 nations that have a free trade zone. It's a trade bloc. In the south, you have the South African Customs Union, which is basically 6 countries where people can kind of freely move about and easily invest in each other. The bottom 6 countries are like the most developed and they kind of have like the best deal out of the whole like development community. And finally, in response to that, you have IGAD, or the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. Same deal, basically just East Africa. It's a trade bloc made of 8 countries. To the best of their ability, they try to cooperate, share a common culture and economic cues. Now, of course, there are so many other IGOs I could have mentioned, but these are the largest and most active ones that you probably should kind of be a little bit more knowledgeable on. I hope this helped. Feel free to use it if you need information on acronyms for the world. I don't know where I'm going with this. Hope you guys have a good one. Get a Geography Now t-shirt. All right, stay cool, stay tuned.